The Dark Hour. Chapter 1. The First Strike. In the small town of Hawthorne, nestled in the remote woods of Oregon, peace was a way of life. The kind of peace that lulled its residents into a false sense of security. It was a place where nothing ever happened, where the days were predictable and the nights were still. But all of that changed when the first body was found. It was a night like any other, quiet, with a thick mist clinging to the ground, shrouding the streets in an eerie fog. The clock had just struck midnight when the scream pierced the silence. A single, blood-curdling cry that echoed through the narrow, empty streets. Martha Thompson was the first to hear it. She was sitting in her living room, sipping on a cup of tea, when the sound shattered the calm. She dropped her cup, the hot liquid spilling across the table as she rushed to the window. Her hands trembled as she pulled back the curtain, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. But there was nothing, only the thick, impenetrable fog. Across town, Sheriff Tom Watson was finishing up his paperwork at the station when the phone rang. He answered it quickly, his heart already pounding in his chest. On the other end was Martha, her voice shaky and filled with terror. "Sheriff, there's been a scream. It came from the old mill, I swear it. You've got to come quickly." Tom grabbed his coat and his flashlight, his mind racing. The old mill had been abandoned for years, a relic of the town's past, now nothing more than a decaying structure hidden away in the woods. He had a bad feeling about this, one that gnawed at him as he made his way through the darkened streets. When he arrived at the mill, the fog had thickened, swirling around him like a living thing. He shone his flashlight on the crumbling building, the beam cutting through the darkness. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. With a deep breath, Tom pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside was damp and musty, filled with the scent of rot and decay. He moved cautiously, his flashlight revealing nothing but dust and shadows. But then he saw it, something dark and twisted lying on the floor. As he moved closer, the beam of light fell on the body of a young woman, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Tom's heart sank as he crouched beside her. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of how she had died. But there was something else, a small object clutched tightly in her hand. Tom pried it loose, his breath catching as he saw what it was. A pocket watch, its glass face shattered, the hands frozen at exactly 3:13 a.m. The dark hour had begun. Chapter 2. The Investigation. The news of the murder spread like wildfire through Hawthorne, shattering the illusion of safety that had blanketed the town for so long. Fear seeped into every corner, turning the friendly faces of neighbors into wary glances, and the quiet streets into paths of dread. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, exchanging theories and tales of what might have happened at the old mill. But none of them could explain the mystery of the pocket watch. Sheriff Tom Watson had never faced anything like this before. The town's biggest crime until now had been the occasional bar fight or a stolen bicycle. But this was different. This was calculated, cold-blooded murder. And the fact that the killer had chosen the old mill, a place that had long been abandoned and forgotten, only added to the sense of unease. Tom called in help from the state police, but he knew that they were just as puzzled as he was. The crime scene had yielded no clues, no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing that could point them in the direction of the killer. And then there was the watch, its hands frozen at that ominous hour. 3:13 a.m., Tom muttered to himself as he stared at the watch on his desk. Why that time? He had gone over every detail of the victim's life, trying to find some connection to the time, to the watch, to the old mill. But nothing made sense. The victim, Emily Harris, was a college student, home for the summer. She had no enemies, no dark secrets that anyone could uncover. She had simply gone for a walk that night as she often did and never came back. The more Tom thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. The killer had to have known Emily's routine, had to have planned this meticulously. But why? What was the significance of 3:13 a.m.? As Tom delved deeper into the investigation, he started to notice a pattern. Emily's death wasn't random. There was something connecting her to other unexplained incidents in the town, strange occurrences that had been happening in the dead of night, but had gone unnoticed until now. People reported hearing odd noises, seeing figures in the fog, and waking up to find things in their homes moved around. But no one had ever linked these events until the murder. Tom's gut told him that these incidents were no coincidence. Someone, or something, was toying with them, using the darkness as a cover. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized that Emily might not have been the first victim. He spent hours going through old police reports, digging into the town's history, trying to find anything that could shed light on what was happening. And then he found it, an old newspaper article from 50 years ago, about a series of mysterious deaths that had plagued Hawthorne. The victims had all died at exactly 3:13 a.m., their bodies found with the same pocket watch clutched in their hands. Tom's blood ran cold as he read the article. It was happening again. But why now? And who was behind it? As he sat in his office, the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. Tom knew he was running out of time. The dark hour was approaching, and with it, the killer would strike again. Chapter 3. The Watchmaker. The discovery of the old newspaper article had shaken Tom to his core. He couldn't escape the growing sense that the past was repeating itself in Hawthorne. But who would resurrect a string of murders from 50 years ago? And how were they connected to the present? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Tom decided to pay a visit to the one person who might hold the answers. Old Man Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh was a relic of the town's past, a man who had lived in Hawthorne longer than anyone could remember. He had once been the town's watchmaker, a skilled craftsman who could repair any timepiece with precision. But after a tragic fire consumed his shop nearly 5 decades ago, Kavanaugh had become a recluse, shunning the world outside his decrepit house on the edge of town. Rumors had swirled around him for years, whispering that he had lost more than just his livelihood in that fire. Some said he had lost his mind, while others claimed that he had dabbled in dark arts, playing with forces he couldn't control. Tom had always dismissed the rumors as the idle gossip of a small town, but now, with the clock ticking toward another possible murder, he was desperate for any lead. He knew that Kavanaugh was old enough to remember the original murders, and perhaps the man's knowledge of timepieces could provide some insight into the strange pocket watch found with Emily. It was late afternoon when Tom arrived at Kavanaugh's home. The sky was already darkening, a prelude to the night's inevitable arrival. The house stood at the end of a lonely dirt road, its once white paint now peeling in gray. The windows were covered with grime, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. As Tom approached the front door, he hesitated, feeling a chill run down his spine. He had been in countless dangerous situations in his career, but something about this house filled him with dread. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the silence. For a moment, he thought that no one would answer, but then he heard the slow, shuffling footsteps of someone approaching. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing the lined face of Old Man Kavanaugh. His eyes were sharp, like those of a bird of prey, and they fixed on Tom with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Kavanaugh's voice was raspy, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "I need to ask you some questions, Mr. Kavanaugh," Tom replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's about the old murders in Hawthorne, back in the 70s. For a moment, Kavanaugh said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he opened the door wider and stepped aside, motioning for Tom to enter. The inside of the house was as decrepit as the outside, with dusty furniture and cobwebs hanging from the corners of the ceiling. The only thing that seemed cared for was a large wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, filled with old watches and clock parts. Kavanaugh noticed Tom's gaze and gave a bitter smile. "Time has always fascinated me, Sheriff," he said, his voice softening as he walked over to the cabinet. "It's something we're all bound by, yet it's also something we can never truly understand. My father was a watchmaker, as was his father before him. I inherited this craft, but it's more than just a skill. It's a way of seeing the world, of seeing patterns where others see only chaos." Tom nodded, unsure of where this conversation was leading. "Did you know about the murders back then? The ones where the victims were found with pocket watches like the one we found with Emily Harris?" Kavanaugh's eyes darkened at the mention of the watch. "Yes, I knew. Everyone in town did. But there was more to those murders than the papers ever reported. The watches, they weren't just ordinary timepieces. They were part of something much older, something cursed." Tom felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, cursed?" Kavanaugh hesitated, as if debating whether or not to continue. Finally, he turned and pulled an old book from a shelf, its leather cover cracked and worn. He handed it to Tom, who flipped it open to find yellowed pages filled with intricate drawings of clocks and watches, along with strange symbols and cryptic writing. "This book has been passed down through my family for generations," Kavanaugh explained. "It contains knowledge that most would consider forbidden. My ancestors believed that certain timepieces could be used to manipulate time itself. to stop it, to speed it up, to even turn it back. But those who tried, they paid a terrible price. They created watches that were cursed, and those who owned them were doomed to die at a specific time, their lives taken by the very object they possessed. Tom stared at the book, his mind racing. Could this be the answer? Was Emily's death, and the deaths from 50 years ago, connected to these cursed watches? And if so, who was behind it? As if reading his thoughts, Kavanaugh spoke again. The man who made those watches was my grandfather. He was a brilliant but tormented man. He believed he could control time, but in the end, time controlled him. He disappeared after the murders stopped, and the watches were never found. Until now. Tom's breath caught. You think someone found one of those watches and is using it to kill? Kavanaugh nodded gravely. Yes, Sheriff. And if you don't find them soon, more lives will be lost. The dark hour will claim them all. Chapter 4. The clock strikes. Tom left Kavanaugh's house with the old book clutched tightly in his hands, his mind a whirl of questions and fears. The sun had set, and night had fallen over Hawthorne, bringing with it the oppressive darkness that now seemed to seep into every corner of the town. He drove back to the station, unable to shake the feeling that the answers he sought were slipping through his fingers like sand. If what Kavanaugh said was true, then the killer wasn't just targeting random victims, they were choosing people connected to those cursed watches. But why? And how could he stop them? Tom spread out the contents of the book on his desk, poring over the old pages in the dim light of his office. The symbols and writings were strange and difficult to decipher, but one thing was clear. These watches were unlike anything he had ever encountered. They were linked to dark rituals, the kind that sent chills down his spine. But they were also linked to something more. A secret society, a group of individuals who had worshipped time as a god and believed they could control it. The more he read, the more Tom realized that this was bigger than he had imagined. The killer wasn't just enacting a twisted revenge. They were carrying out a ritual, a rite that had been lost to time but was now being revived. And the pocket watches were the key. But how could he find the killer before they struck again? How could he stop them from claiming another victim? The answer came to him in a sudden, terrifying realization. He couldn't. Not without more information, not without understanding how the watches worked. And there was only one way to do that. Tom looked up at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight, and he knew that the dark hour was approaching. The killer would strike again tonight, he was certain of it. And if he was going to stop them, he needed to act now. He grabbed his coat and the old book, shoving it into his bag. There was one place he hadn't searched yet, one place that might hold the answers he needed, the old mill. It had been the site of Emily's murder, but Tom had a feeling it was more than just a random location. There was something about that place that was tied to the watches, to the ritual, and to the killer. Tom drove through the empty streets, the fog once again rolling in like a living thing. The town was silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. When he arrived at the mill, the air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He stepped out of his car, his flashlight cutting through the fog as he made his way toward the entrance. The door creaked open just as it had the night he found Emily. Inside, the darkness was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. But Tom forced himself to move forward, his steps echoing in the empty space. As he reached the center of the mill, he noticed something strange. A faint ticking sound, barely audible but unmistakable. He followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. It led him to a hidden compartment in the floor, one that had been expertly concealed. With trembling hands, Tom pried it open, revealing a small wooden box inside. He opened the box, his breath catching as he saw what lay within. Another pocket watch, identical to the one found with Emily, its hands frozen at 3:13 a.m. But before he could react, the ticking grew louder, filling the room with its insistent rhythm. Tom spun around, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. He was no longer alone. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. In his hand, he held a pocket watch, its glass face reflecting the dim light. "Time's up, Sheriff," the man whispered, his voice cold and emotionless. "The dark hour is upon us." Tom's mind raced as he tried to figure out how to stop him, how to break the cycle of death that had begun. But before he could act, the man pressed the button on the watch and everything went black. Chapter 5. The Haunting Echoes. When Tom opened his eyes, he found himself in darkness, but this wasn't the darkness of the mill. It was something deeper, more profound, as if he had been plunged into a void where time had no meaning. The air was thick and cold, and he could hear the distant, haunting echoes of a clock ticking somewhere in the shadows. He struggled to his feet, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. One moment he had been facing the killer in the old mill, and the next he was... where? The void seemed endless, and as he moved forward, the ticking grew louder, more insistent, as if urging him to follow. Tom had no choice but to obey. He walked through the darkness, each step feeling like it could be his last. The ticking grew faster, almost frantic, as he reached what seemed to be a clearing in the void. There, suspended in midair, was the pocket watch, the same one the killer had used. As he approached, the watch began to glow with an eerie light, illuminating a series of ghostly images that flickered around him like a twisted slideshow. He saw the faces of the victims, each one frozen in a moment of terror, their eyes wide with fear. He saw the old mill, now a sinister monument to the deaths it had witnessed. And then he saw the man, the killer, standing over each victim, his expression blank as he held the cursed watch in his hand. But the images didn't stop there. They began to move backward as if time itself was rewinding. Tom watched in horror as the scenes shifted to a different era, one filled with sepia tones and flickering gas lamps. The killer was there, but younger, his face more human, less monstrous. He was working in a workshop, carefully crafting a pocket watch, his hands moving with precision and purpose. Tom realized with a sickening jolt that he was witnessing the birth of the curse, the moment when the watches were first created. The man in the vision was Kavanaugh's grandfather, the original watchmaker, and as Tom watched, he saw the moment when everything went wrong. The watchmaker had attempted to imbue the watches with power to control time, but instead, he had unleashed something dark, something that had consumed him and everyone who came into contact with the cursed timepieces. The vision shifted again, this time showing the watchmaker's descent into madness. He became obsessed with his creations, believing they could unlock the secrets of time and death. But as he used the watches, he began to lose his humanity, becoming the cold, hollow-eyed killer that now haunted Hawthorne. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the images continued, each one more disturbing than the last. He saw the watchmaker's final moments as he realized the horror he had unleashed. In a desperate attempt to stop the curse, he had hidden the watches, hoping that they would never be found. But his efforts had been in vain, as the darkness had persisted, waiting for the moment when it would be awakened once more. And now it had found a new vessel. The vision began to fade, and Tom was left alone in the void, the ticking of the pocket watch growing louder, more deafening. He knew that he was running out of time, literally. The dark hour was approaching, and if he didn't stop the killer, more lives would be lost. But how could he break a curse that had been in place for over a century? Tom reached out and grabbed the pocket watch, feeling its cold metal against his skin. The moment he did, the ticking stopped and the darkness began to recede. He found himself back in the old mill, standing in the same spot where he had faced the killer. But this time the room was empty, save for the pocket watch in his hand. He knew what he had to do. Tom left the mill and drove straight to Kavanaugh's house. The old man was waiting for him, as if he had known all along that Tom would return. Without a word, Tom handed him the pocket watch, the final piece of the puzzle. Kavanaugh took it, his expression grim. "It's time to end this, Sheriff." Tom nodded, watching as Kavanaugh opened the old book and began to recite a ritual in a language Tom couldn't understand. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an otherworldly energy as Kavanaugh worked to undo the curse that had plagued his family for generations. The watch in Kavanaugh's hand began to glow, its hands moving backward at an impossible speed. The ticking returned, but this time it was different. Slower, more deliberate, as if time itself was being rewound. The room around them seemed to warp and twist, the very fabric of reality bending under the strain of the ritual. Finally, with a resounding click, the watch's hands stopped at 12 a.m., the moment before the dark hour began. Kavanaugh let out a shuddering breath, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. "It's done," he whispered, collapsing into a chair. Tom didn't need to ask if it had worked. The oppressive weight that had hung over Hawthorne was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt peaceful. The curse had been lifted, and the killer, whoever they had been, was no more. But as Tom looked at the pocket watch, now dark and lifeless, he knew that the town of Hawthorne would never be the same. The horrors of the past had left their mark, a reminder that some things were better left forgotten. And as he walked out into the first light of dawn, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that time had not been conquered, but merely postponed. The dark hour had passed, but its echoes would linger in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would strike again.